And let's say together our opening.
There is but one presence and one power in the universe and in my life. God, the good, omnipotent.
Let's welcome our speaker. You're it.
A little bit of show and tell today. Okay. So this is Science and Religion. Let me first of all say that it looks like I've really only got these 2 more Sundays with you. So this week, and then in 2 weeks. And this is a topic that I've chosen, well, for a couple reasons. It's near and dear to me, for one. The second reason, I suppose, is that it's sort of rare, and you don't get this very often. And so it's like going to a restaurant and ordering something that you can't get at home. So here you go, anyway. It starts off with this guy. I don't know if you've ever seen this book, The Dancing Woolly Masters.
Yeah.
Okay. The book is 1979. And so what happened is that an overview of the new physics is the subtitle of it, by Gary Zukav. And what he was doing in 1979 was bringing together particularly quantum physics. Now bear in mind, from 1974 till 1980 was when I was at Purdue University studying physics. And it's sort of all-consuming. You don't have much time for a personal life when you're doing that. And so right toward the end of that time there, this book comes out. So I immediately read it. The very next year, by the way, 1980, it won the National Book Award for the category of science. So it was extremely well received. And the purpose of it was trying to understand the new physics, which at that time would be mostly quantum mechanics, what happens at the subatomic level in our world. And the problem with it, with understanding quantum mechanics in the first place, first of all, the math is like mind-numbingly hard. But a more down-to-earth reason why it's hard is that there's no physical analog to what the physics is doing. So for example, if you're studying a ball bearing rolling down a plane and you're trying to figure out how fast will it be when it gets to the bottom, you can sit there and have the equations and you can do the math on it, but you can also look at the ball bearing and you can look at the plane. You can actually do it physically. You can't do any of that with quantum mechanics. It's like there's no thing that you can wrap your mind around or see or touch in the physical world that really corresponds to what the math is doing. So he was trying to explain this new physics, which at this point is several decades old, 50 years old or so, to a general audience. It's not aimed at scientists in particular, but just anybody and everyone. So I read the book, and then I learned within that first year that he had been invited to come to the physics department at Purdue University and deliver a lecture. And it was about 2 months away when I saw the notice that he had been invited. So I was thrilled, absolutely thrilled. And so I reread the book. And then I'm attending the lecture, I'm sitting in the back, and virtually anybody and everybody in the physics department was there. So we had a good 100 people or so, half of them professors, half of them grad students for the most part, were attending his lecture. And he's about halfway into it when the very first professor stood up and walked out. And he's one of these kind who was right sort of in the middle of the seats, the bank of seats. He stood up noisily and didn't try to be discreet at all, but rather sort of saying this to him as he left. And then another, and then another, and then they started leaving in 2s and 3s and 4s. And I was, at first I had multiple emotions that I had on it. I was embarrassed, I was very angry, I was surprised because I'd read the book twice and he hadn't said anything in the lecture that was different from what's in the book. So then it gave me the impression that, like, well, hey, maybe I'm the only one who did his homework. And this was like news to them. It has in it many of the things that are now characterized by New Thought, New Agey, woo-woo kind of stuff in it. Some of that is in there, but he's integrating it pretty much at an initial level. Nobody had done that before. And so by the end of it, the majority of the professors and some of the grad students had walked out. It ended up having an effect on me that pretty much was sort of the opposite of the effect that they probably wanted to have on me. I had that feeling, there's that line from Shakespeare, "Methinks thou protesteth much." It's like, what are they afraid of? And then it had the ultimate effect on me. It's like, I got to look into this more. And so I did. So I began not just studying my physics, but also the interpretation or the theologizing or the philosophizing of what science ultimately means in our world. It's like a fascinating topic, but it was at its infancy back then. So I came across this book, Physics and Philosophy, by Werner Heisenberg. Heisenberg Uncertainty Principle. I'm sure you all know about it. I really wish I had my notes on this. This is a book that I bought just a few years ago when I saw it in a bookstore. But the one that I used for my thesis when I was doing my schoolwork belonged to the library, so I had to give it back. But a fascinating book. And then comes along this one, which I left in my office. So then I decide that, well, let me be very truthful about it. I didn't decide to leave physics and go into the ministry. I got kicked out of the PhD program. And you were not allowed to ever get a C, let alone anything worse than that. And I got a C in one of my classes. And so I was not going to be a professional physicist. That career option was closed for me. And so at the same time, I had been attending that whole 7 years, I had been attending a marvelous church, and in which I was falling in love with theology. So I said to my wife, how about let's go to seminary. And so off we went. Unbeknownst to me, the president of the seminary was James McCord. And he was a brilliant man, but he had an advantage on everybody else that's sort of unfair. And that is he only needed a half an hour of sleep per day. And so every night he would read a book. And so he had 365 new books per year under his belt. So he was a brilliant, educated man. And he decided, as president of the seminary, that we need a course in the dialogue of science and religion. And so I had the deep privilege of taking the first ever science and religion seminary course offered in the United States, maybe in the world.
Wow.
And it was taught by a professor by the name of Stanley Jaki, J-A-K-I, a Hungarian-born priest and also a PhD in physics. How many of them were running around in the 70s and the 80s? But they found this guy, and he taught a brilliant class. Once again, I was sort of amazed on it. But the textbook was the one I left in my office, was called Planets and Planetarians. And the thesis of the book was this, that the reason Galileo, Copernicus, all those kind of people, the reason they were able to figure out the orbits of the planets and realize a heliocentric model was superior was because they believed in the rationality of the creation. And they believed in that because they believed in the rationality of God. All these people were deeply religious people. And they knew God was reasonable. They knew God was smart. They knew God would make things in a rational way. Therefore, we've got to be able to figure this out because it's built by a rational person. And they believed that deep in their hearts, and that led them to finally understand orbits, for example. So I took that class, and then thereafter, I subscribed to the only journal of religion and science, and subscribed to this then for the entire rest of my career. It's called Zygon. It's named after a zygote, which is the joining together of a sperm and an egg. And the idea is you take these two completely different things and you put them together and new life emerges out of it. And so that's why they named it that. And then comes this book. Oh my goodness. Have you ever looked at this one ever? No. So Lynn McTaggart wrote The Field. This was back in 1987 when she published this. But she did it as a journalist, not as a scientist. She did a super job of interviewing all these people across the country. Now this is now where the dialogue is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 years old at this point, and comes up with this quest for the secret force in the universe called The Field, and it's based upon a quote from Einstein that he said in 1915, where he said that the field is the only reality. Now here's a person who basically believes in God. The field is the only reality. And so he's making the assertion that there's something going on between the physical realm that we all experience and the pervasiveness of divinity. Time marches on, and eventually this gets published. In whom we live and move and have our being. So this is by Philip Clayton and Arthur Peacock. Philip Clayton is the person who's the publisher of this. And then Arthur Peacock is the founding member of the Society of Ordained Physicists in Great Britain. There's not many of them. It's not a big thing. But we live and move and have our being, and it's all about panentheism, the notion that the physical realm that we see and dominates our attention is within divinity. It's not necessarily equal to it, but rather the spiritual realm encompasses all of the physical realm. The spiritual realm encompasses all of the physical realm, but it's not necessarily just limited by it, that there's more to it than that. So, that's a little bit of an overview of how the conversation has taken place. One of the results of it, though, is that for churches, just generally, people, religious people, people of faith, Christians, Jews, whatever, is that we need to look at how we define God. If there's going to be one singular upshot for this dialogue that has now been, a few decades old, it's that we gotta figure out what we mean when we say God. Because the guy sitting up there on the throne in heaven answering prayers doesn't quite cut it anymore. So, 4 observations that I'd like to make that are aimed toward helping us define what God is. These are 4 science observations. There's estimated to be 100 billion stars in our Milky Way. So 100 billion. So a million is 10 to the 6. A billion is 10 to the 9. A trillion is 10 to the 12. So this is 10 to the 11 stars in our Milky Way. And it was in the 1920s, so almost a century ago, but not quite, was when Edwin Hubble, using his telescope, not the Hubble telescope, but one a lot smaller than that, was when he realized that Andromeda was not a star, but was actually indeed a galaxy. So we have not known that as a species, that there is more than one galaxy out there. We've not known that for even 100 years at this point. So then, the Hubble telescope finally gets made. It just celebrated its 25th birthday not too long ago. And there was a time, this would be about 7 or 8 years ago at this point, there was a time where scientists all across the world buy time on the Hubble telescope. So I have an experiment, or there's someplace where I want to look, and so I need it for 12 hours, I need it for 2 days, whatever, you buy time on the telescope. And they had an 11-day commitment that fell apart at the last minute for the telescope. And so what they did is the director of the Hubble telescope portion of NASA, the director finds himself with a 1-day notice. What can we do for the next 11 days with the telescope? It's free and clear. And so he sent out an email blast to astronomers all across the world, give me your ideas now. And one of the ideas that came back was to look at this one particular place in the sky. It's just slightly above the Big Dipper. So, but it's noteworthy, it's about 1/30 the size of the moon, is the size of the space that they wanted to look at. But it's noteworthy in that there's nothing there. Binoculars, still absolutely nothing there. A 4-inch telescope, still nothing there. As soon as you get up to a 6-inch telescope is when you can see that there's actually one star in that space of sky. So they said, let's look at that spot for 11 days. Sounds sort of strange, but that's what they did. And they came back and it was just simply full of galaxies. Full of galaxies. And it's just like, okay, this is strange. And so that image that got published on it was called the Hubble Deep Field, the HDF image. So they repeated the experiment again, only this time they moved the Hubble over the South Pacific. So the nearest land from where they had it up in the sky, the nearest land was over 1,000 miles away in every direction. So no light pollution at all. And they did it again and came back with the identical result. They looked a little bit longer this time, and so they got an image called the ultra deep field on this. But now, doing the math, if you extrapolate out, it's just like there's full of stars, full of galaxies that way, and it's full of galaxies that way. If it's indeed that way, all the way around, we're looking at 10 to the 13 galaxies. So 10 to the 12 is a trillion. So 10 trillion galaxies. And we've not known this but for a few years. And each one, if the Milky Way is average, is with 100 billion stars. So we're looking at 10 to the 24 stars out there. And we don't have the ability to take that kind of number in. 10 to the 24, there's not even a name for it. It's just so unimaginably huge. But remember, the reason I'm telling you this story is for us to figure out what we mean when we say God. So story number 2. This guy, Brian Greene, The Elegant Universe, PBS special by the same name. And what he's doing is, once again, looking at the results of quantum physics, except he's not trying to sell it to a popular audience, but rather one of the finest scholars around on it. And he's the one who's been popularizing the idea of string theory that you may have heard about, where that's what exists at the absolute smallest level. But one of the side consequences of this, not the main thing at all, but just a side consequence of it, is that it appears that in our world there are 11 dimensions. And then, once again, an extremely difficult thing to ponder. You know, we've got our 3 spatial dimensions, and we've got the dimension of time, so let's say 4. And each dimension, as you know, is infinitely more than the preceding one. So a plane is infinitely bigger than a line. And a line is infinitely bigger than a point. And a volume is infinitely bigger than a plane. 11 dimensions that exist in our world, and our consciousness seems to be generally limited to these 4. Okay, so 10 to the 24 stars and 11 dimensions now. Now one other, and this is a difficult one to explain, and so wish me well on this one. This would be about 7 or 8 years ago. It's called the 10-kilometer experiment. And the gist of it is, I'll try not to use jargon for you on it, but the gist on it is that when an atom cools, the way in which an atom cools is it sends off a photon, a little ray of light. So it gets rid of this little packet of energy, and thereby it can cool down. It's not as energetic as it was. However, sometimes it will send off 2 photons at the same time. And when it does that, the 2 remain symmetrical. So if this one's vibrating up and down, this one's vibrating sideways, so that the 2 of them are symmetrical when you combine them together. So what they did is they noticed that, well, if you take this one and you run it through your ray bands, and you take your polarization of it and you turn it 90 degrees, this one was going like this, and then it goes like this. It's like, why would it even care? But it does. And so then they tried to do this experiment at 10 kilometers. And they happened to use some phone lines, very high quality fiber optic phone lines that had been set up in Switzerland that hadn't been connected to the phone system yet. And they used those phone lines to have an atom that sends off its photon this way, and then at a 10-kilometer distance, they altered this one, and sure enough, the other one responded. But now here's the kicker. It responded immediately. It didn't respond at the speed of light. It responded faster than the speed of light. So at that time, when the initial experiment was made, this photon responded at 300 times the speed of light, which happened to be the extent of their equipment. The experiment was repeated a few years later with better equipment, and found out that it responded at 10 to the 5 times the speed of light, which was the limit of that equipment. In other words, it's responding instantaneously. which has this huge consequence for understanding what is happening in a subterranean way in our world. That there is a undergirding oneness, an undergirding connection, an undergirding relationship between it all. This isn't theology, it's physics. And fourth, so we got 10 to the 24 stars, 11 dimensions, a mind-numbing connectedness and oneness to it all. And then I'll conclude my little thing here with a guy by the name of Max Tegmark. He's a astrophysicist at MIT. So you can guess he's a smart guy. And he wrote a book in 2014 called Our Mathematical Universe. And once again, I'm not going to use jargon. I'm not going to go into the argument. As a matter of fact, I probably couldn't. But the gist of his argument is this. Physical reality, you know, the material world that's right in front of our faces. Well, what is it really? I mean, deep down inside, what is it? Well, it's actually just fields. You know, each particle is just nothing more than a condensed field, which we've known for more than a century now. Well, what is a field anyway? Deep down inside. And that's where physics pretty much embarrassingly is sort of clueless. Don't know. But what it seems to be is relationships. So that this field affects this field. There's no vision to it. There's no weight to it. It's something that can be detected, but otherwise it's sort of ghost-like. But this field can affect this field. And so what he says is that that's actually what it is. It's mathematical relationships that govern and deep down inside what our world is. Well, what's a mathematical construct anyway? What's a mathematical relationship other than just math? And what's math except an idea? And so what he's saying, not religiously at all, he's saying what the world is a very big idea. This is an MIT physicist. This isn't religion. This isn't some preacher. So it's an idea with 10 to the 13 galaxies, 11 dimensions, and connected in such a supreme way. But let me remind you that our purpose is to define God. So this sermon, such as it is from the point of view of physics and math. That's sort of my home turf on that. But it could be from the point of view of biology. People in biology are doing the same kind of work, particularly one guy down in Maryland right now. It could be done from the point of view of psychology and consciousness studies. And so what does this have to do with God, with divinity? And what I would suggest to you, this is my personal belief system, is that God is that idea. That there's an equal sign right there. God is that idea. And we are all expressions of it. Now, the word idea sounds a little bit abstract, or maybe even a bit sterile for you. But that idea also equals love, equals consciousness, equals spirit, equals life, equals energy. We use all of these kind of terms to try to get a handle on the magnificence and the utter glory of that idea. So let me conclude. There's a verse in the book of Hebrews. By faith we understand that the world was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was made out of things that do not appear. And then here's one verse from the letter of Paul to the Romans. Ever since, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. And then I'll conclude with this quick line from Friedrich Schiller, philosopher of a generation, 2 generations ago. And actually, in its original German, it's mounted over the archway of the entrance into one of the buildings at Harvard, where he said, "It is the spirit which builds the body for itself." Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. And as far as any kind of comments, but is spirit considered a dimension? Out of the 11 dimensions that you mentioned, would you consider spirit a dimension?
No. My personal belief system, such as it is that spirit actually encompasses them all.
Encompasses them all.
And so that when we grow spiritually, or when we attend to our spiritual nature of our lives, that what's happening is actually we're dipping our toe into other dimensions. So it explains the otherwise physically unexplainable sides of what happens in our lives. Like when you really know something that you otherwise wouldn't know.
And what about when you said, everything keeps expanding with the new apparatus, and we keep seeing an expanding universe? Could it also be, I think physics talks about, no matter what you look at, as you look at it, it expands, or it somehow becomes more. So it's our attention to it, or we are the creator's attention to it, and it just keeps going. So is that like a principle?
It's so strange.
Yeah.
It's called popping the quiff. And the quiff stands for the quantum equation on it. And what happens is when consciousness looks at it, so say here's a particle and it can't decide if it wants to be a particle or a wave. Here's a little thing of energy, and what's it going to be? And it's just like, as soon as we look at it, that's when it makes up its mind. And if we're looking at it, it's like, you sure look like a particle, and it says, fine, I'll be a particle. And you look at it for a wave, and it'll say, fine, I'll be a wave. And then there was an experiment done only like 2 years ago over in Italy, where a brilliant idea came to one of the physicists. How can we ask if it's a particle or a wave at the same time? Can we ask the question, are you particle, are you wave, but you're asking at the same time? The answer came back, both. Yeah.
As you were talking about that connection and everything, I thought about how many times I've read where something was invented or thought of in different parts of the world by different people at the same time. And it just seemed like that was a mini version of that. And
It's happened many times.
yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Have you read anything from science that says the universe breathes? In other words, not only does it expand, but it also contracts.
I have nothing that I can say conclusively on that. But yes, I have heard that. What do you know about it?
Well, some of my spiritual teachers talk about that, and I was just wondering if there was a parallel to it in science.
Okay, not that I'm aware of on that. No. Yes.
The Course in Miracles says we are all but an idea in the mind of God.
Does it really?
Just the idea in the mind of God. And to me, that's so exciting.
Yeah, and so's the world,
Yeah.
and so's our pet dog.
Right.
All of it, yes. Yeah,
Well, I thought of something that was in the Seth books. I was bringing the Seth books because he talks so much about physics. Is that when there's pauses between when we breathe between our breaths, that we are actually focused in other dimensions when that happens. And he speaks a lot about all these different dimensions, the ones that he's in, and he's spoken to colleagues and in these other dimensions. They don't believe him about this physical reality we're in and that he used to be in. They can't imagine it. So there's a lot of information in his books about also this, how we are idea in God's mind and how God actually created this universe that we're in and how we create it as well. So, and I
Because
would
we're all part of
suppose
the
that
one
Gary,
idea.
yeah,
There's
Gary
only one
Zukov
idea.
and Lynn Taggart, I wouldn't be surprised if they read Seth because Jane Roberts created the New Age. It wasn't single-handedly, but isn't what she was doing. She was just a great mystic. So she could tap into these other dimensions, and they're in all her books.
Yeah.
And many people have given her credit, even Deepak Chopra, Marianne Williamson, and others. But that always stuck in my mind, if we could meditate, and sometimes you do, if you meditate, you do go into other dimensions, as we all know. So
we're dreaming.
yes, and Native Americans also delineate many different dimensions than our science has ever recognized.
Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes,
Can I
Jerry.
take 2 seconds to read something out of this 1965 publication again? Just a couple sentences. It says, the reason that is that unity does not claim to have the last word in truth. Perhaps it might be more accurate to say it seeks to have the first word. Unity wants only to be the stimulus toward thinking truthwards.
Thank you.
Science reveals more. That was written 53 years ago, before Gary Zukov.
Right. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you. I want to stand up.
That'll be good. I think he'll like it. Because his topic's about science, right? Science and religion.
Yeah.
So yesterday I wrote this song about science and religion.
But
Well,
actually,
I'm
just
glad-
out like that.
I'm glad I gave him the answer I did, because
I like writing new songs.
Oh.
So, it's called photosynthesis. Sunlight is the energy feeding every cell of me. Photosynthesis keeps me alive. We need trees, water, and sun, and carbon dioxide. Fusion is the source of energy in the sun. Spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe. The spirit vastly superior to us. With our modest powers, we must feel humble. That's what Albert Einstein said. The gift of mental power comes from God, divine being. And if we concentrate our minds on that truth,
I'm sure more than a passive state of being. It is the active energy that empowers my thoughts and brings them into manifestation in this human experience. I am always expressing faith in something, either spiritual truth or dualistic illusion. I am grateful for the growing awareness that allows me to recognize where I am placing my faith and to make conscious, creative choices through each day. If I find myself giving my faith to thoughts of lack or limitation, I shift my focus to the spiritual substance that can accomplish all things through me. It is by embracing this understanding of faith that I create a new consciousness, choice by choice. But ask in faith, never doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. James 1:16.
Wow.
Thank you.